As we heard earlier this morning, one of the great changes over the last few years in political marketing is the greater ease, density, and sophistication of onboarding offline data and profiles to locate and enhance through digital. Raises a whole host of questions about the ways in which matching is going on, what's most effective, but also, especially within the context of political campaigning, privacy and sharing rights. I think just this week we saw some evidence of that in some recent study that actually poked at the privacy policies of some of the major campaigns with some staggering results. To take the lead on this panel, we have our own Joe Mandisi. He is the editor-in-chief at MediaPost. He oversees all content that appears at MediaPost. He's been covering the agency and advertising beat since we established yesterday, 1979, right?
Yeah.
Right, Joe? 1979. Joe Mandisi, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. So we go from bright, shiny objects to dull, dense data. So earlier, there was the programmatic TV panel, said they were the nerdiest of the day. No way. All right, so let me do the quick intros, and then we'll get into the scintillating deep dive into data and matching. From my left and your right, we have Grace Briscoe, who is Vice President of Centro's Candidates and Causes Group, which delivers digital media expertise and technology to political marketers and their agencies. Since joining Centro nearly a decade ago, she developed Centro's political practice and founded the DC office in 2010, although she actually resides in New York. Yay. Then we have Lindsay Conwell, who is an AE of U.S. politics for Google. That says a lot, words, U.S. politics, but even more narrowly defined on the Republican side. So I get some partisanship already. In the elections team at Google, they utilize their entire stack to improve the candidates' digital marketing. Prior to Google, she led business development and client services and digital and television advertising partnerships for i360. And then we have Keegan Gudis, who is partner, head of advertising at Revolution Messaging. He has more than 9 years' experience specifically managing digital democratic campaigns and for nonprofits and political campaigns. His firm VoxP Media was a pioneer in social media tracking. And since joining Revolution in 2009, his team has implemented a creative targeting strategy for Healthcare for America Now and the Wisconsin uprising against Governor Scott Walker. And he's currently focusing his efforts in digital advertising director for Bernie 2016. And then we have Andy Hun, who is co-founder and COO of Resonate, which I think is one of the coolest. I define as a data management platform on steroids. They are really brilliant at accessing and integrating a lot of different data sets, and we'll get into that later. At Resonate, he oversees product research, data, and software development strategies with more than 20 years' experience. He is an active member of the DC startup and tech community. He resides here in this town. Prior to Resonate, he was vice president of corporate business development for CyberTrust. So normally I don't go rhyme and verse, and you can read more about their profiles online, but I thought it was important you understood the composition of this panel. What I'd like to do is kind of start off just by asking you to each describe specifically what your role is in regards to matching data about consumer profiles with their political targeting affiliations, and how you do it, and what role you play in your organization. And I think that'd be a good way to set the stage, and then we'll drill down into what's good and bad practices. Is that good?
Sure. Well, Centro is an ad technology and services company, so we work with agencies and marketers on helping them execute digital campaigns across the spectrum. We have an in-house programmatic platform for direct guaranteed buying as well as for biddable media, which is where a lot of the data onboarding and data targeting piece comes in. We have partnerships with onboarding companies, as well as with, in the political space, voter file vendors. So I've found that connecting the dots with vendors that the campaigns are already working with for their mail file, being able to plug and play with those in the digital space is a big help and really increases their comfort level. I think that answers.
If possible, if each of you could give a little example, it could be off the record if it's a current campaign that you're working on, just anonymize it, or if it's a past one, or just one that you know of that you think really illustrates how data matching works from your perspective. Can you think of one? Or you can come back to that.
I think we're seeing some really interesting things already this cycle. There's more data. We've been doing it for a few years, but there's more data, and there's more data around some of the probabilistic, I can't ever say that.
Probabilistic.
Matching around issues, around key groups and voter segments. That's starting to come into play, which I think correlates to messaging in interesting ways and is allowing for a little more sophisticated use of this.
So Lindsay, how do you and your team at Google Politics do it? And if you have an example, that'd be great.
Sure, of course. So at Google, we work with campaigns, committees, and super PACs to really build out best-in-class digital campaigns, really what a digital campaign should look like in 2016, and how they can achieve that across all of the Google platforms, everything from search to display to YouTube to our programmatic buying platform, which is DoubleClick. And we help them come up with solutions based on the data that they have, the data that we have, to really extend the reach. So our approach to data and targeting in general is really what we consider smart reach, and that is combining the targeting that you find with hyper-targeted data approaches with scale. So not to forget to take into account intent-based advertising as well, to layer that in as well, and then to do it at scale, so across the world's largest platforms. Google, of course, being one with billions of monthly searches, Gmail being another, and YouTube being another. If you look at YouTube, in Q3 of 2015, we saw over 650 political views alone. So data is a part of it, but reach is quite another. So we work with campaigns to make sure that they achieve both. And then as far as an example goes, one from the commercial industry that actually just came out is Pegasus Airlines put to use something that came up on the last panel, and that is customer match, or the ability to match email addresses in. So they built out targeted universes, targeted advertising at those, and as a result saw over 32% higher click-through rate on those audiences that they targeted, and over 12% increase in revenue per conversion. So the targeting is working.
Keegan?
Hey, I'm Keegan. I like the idea of scale. That is something that we in politics face a challenge for so long, and I think one of the problems we've seen in the industry as a result of people seeking more scale was the huge growth of ad fraud, which I'm sure we'll get back to later. But what I focus on is all of the media buying for our agency right now, all of the digital advertising for Bernie Sanders, helping him try to take on the establishment. I'm not sure how many of you are focusing on Twitter today, but that was supposed to be a joke referencing some stuff today. So. And in terms of example, I would say that we work primarily with LiveRamp and several other, Google and Facebook and several other vendors try to match data as quickly as possible. I would say the struggle that we have quite frequently is trying to figure out, are we going to try to take the best, most recent data and try to get that match quickly, or use something that is already available? And I think one of the challenges that is starting to be solved in the industry is being able to address like matching new CRM data faster, because currently like you have a long period. So one of the challenges that we're always facing is really just getting into can we make use of something like with Google's interest targeting that will hit the targets, or do we have to match a new file?
Very good. So our business is a little bit different than some of the other folks on the panel. We are fundamentally focused on consumer analytics and activation based upon data that we collect ourselves. We at Resonate run a giant research infrastructure where we do massive scale online survey research, and we also ingest massive scale online behavioral data so we can understand things about the electorate and also sort of in the advocacy space about advocacy issues and people's positions at scale across the US that heretofore hasn't really been available online. And that data for us powers kind of two businesses, the first being an ability to target audiences with a much greater granularity than you've typically been able to in the digital world, and you can with the voter file more conventionally. But it also enables an analytics business for us where we can provide lots of insight into the segments that may be of interest to you, however you define those, whether those started from the voter file or in some other way. So we do a lot of execution of campaigns based upon voter file matching, and we'll talk a lot about matching of files here. But we do a ton of work that has nothing to do with the voter file as well, and sometimes we do work that's kind of a hybrid of the two, because we've got lots of this other data that we can bring to bear that describes in richer ways the political and voting beliefs of people and their values and motivations and psychographics. I know there's some folks that have come across the pond to help some campaigns with psychographics. We've been doing that since 2009. I think it's cute they came over. But some examples with regard to voter file and use of data that I would tell you about. We do a lot of just execution of campaigns based on segments, and that's quite easy. We'll talk about the mechanics of that. We've also done a lot of work with voter files where we use that to learn more about your segments. So we've done work with people where we've been able to bring a much greater insight into the groups they think are important to them so they can affect their strategy in more interesting ways, and we can talk about what that means. In other cases, we did one voter file match where the purpose was purely to understand voters in the relevant districts so that they could change the scripts in their walk plans to go from door to door and how they should speak to people about issues that are relevant to them. So there's lots of ways the matches can be used, but it's clearly something that's come up more and more.
Wow, that's an incredibly granular execution. Thank you for sharing that. So Keegan, you mentioned fraud. We had a whole conference here yesterday on fraud, and the thing I learned about matching data with targets was that fraud and trust don't play in Washington, D.C. Politics does, because this conference is way oversubscribed today. I just think people in Washington don't have trust issues. I don't know. But normally, this is where I like to ask the audience to understand the composition of you, and I would say, you know, are you an agency, a vendor, or a publisher? But actually, if it's okay, I just want to get a sense for what the political partisanship is here. So raise your hand if you're of a Republican Party persuasion. Okay.
All right.
Somehow I think there's trust issues here. Raise your hand if you're of a Democratic Party persuasion. All right, a little more honesty, that figures. Okay, and raise your hand if you're not affiliated with either of those two party persuasions. Clearly people are lying here. Okay, all right. Okay, so I mean, in principle, I think what we're talking about here is understanding the target you're going after. It's no different than with a consumer packaged good or any other category. And then finding the data out there so that you can match them in the media you want to reach them with and figure out the message to do that. How much of that is now being done through technology and automation and you know, algorithms and machine learning versus the human process now than you know it had been in the past? How much more of it is man or machine now than historically? Are we moving more in that direction? Just talk a little bit, hopefully anecdotally, about how much of it is machines and data versus people making judgment calls.
I mean, I would say in the political space, it's still very much a human process. I think that there are a lot of really interesting advents of technology that are changing that. I would say, especially on the DR side, there's a lot more on the automation side that is really improving the performance of DR. But when it comes down to like political persuasion, we are still, and if there's any TV consultants in the room, I apologize, but we're still kind of at the mercy of TV consultants who have a process that is based on a lot of great research from polling work done, but it's very rigid and doesn't always, it's not able to adapt to maybe like a changing media cycle as quickly as possible because it relies on, okay, we get research back, we put the ads together, we get 50 people to sign off on it, we run that ad, we test again and see what happens. I think what digital is really like, for lack of a better word, disrupting in the political media space is that you really can't rely on that system to stay ahead of the news cycle anymore. And I don't think we're there yet, but we are getting to a place where there will be, I feel like, a lot more automated responses around, like, okay, these group of people have taken certain actions online. Our research shows that they should be getting a certain message, and that happens more automatically. But at least on the Democratic side, we're a lot of that's still being done manually.
I would just add to that, we have a business in the brand world. We started in politics and advocacy back in 2008, but we also have a brand business out of New York, which works with big brands like Microsoft and Amazon and Toyota and these kind of folks. And I would tell you, in the compare of the two markets, the two segments, we see that definitely within that brand corporate use of digital advertising, there's a greater embracing already of allowing the data to speak for what the segments should be. Where in the DC market, we definitely still see a more subjective human, I've got a thesis, this is what the segment should be, and to tie that to sort of an example as it relates to data and so forth as we talk about that, one of the things we do with a lot of our corporate clients as well as here in town is just by tagging the digital assets of a campaign or of a brand like Toyota, we can describe what those people look like. And that's just factual observation. It's not our sort of thesis. And that's being used a great deal to inform both the segments and also the messaging that should result. There's definitely still a little bit of a lag in this particular issue in town.
Okay.
I would actually add to that too. At Google in general, we believe that data trumps opinion. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier was intent-based advertising or intent-based targeting, and the importance of relying on what voters in our case are actually telling you their intentions are or actually seeking out. So in the commercial space, a few interesting anecdotes, if you will, are if you look at mobile searches, those for sporting goods are actually 56% female. And when it comes to influencers in the skin and body space, they are 65% male. So you can make assumptions about a particular demographic that aren't necessarily the case. And without allowing the data to speak for itself, you may be missing a large part of your target audience.
Yeah, intent signals are awesome. Can you talk a little bit about how you find them for political persuasion in particular? And besides search queries, which is a really powerful one, what else do you look at?
Sure. Search queries, first-party data through Customer Match, which we mentioned. Certainly third-party data across DoubleClick, our programmatic ad platform. And then beyond that, seeking similar audiences. So based on search queries, site visits, user behavior, finding audiences that look like those to, again, expand reach. There are any number of ways to do it.
But do you have an example where you're able to identify the data trumping the intuition on who is a political candidate or a prospect?
So there are ways to measure. We have a tool called BrandLift. And when you're running a campaign, you can set up essentially a measurement or survey tool that does two things. It surveys users as an ad is running, holds out a control group, and sees if that ad is actually resonating with the prospective voter the way that you expect it to, and if not, change your strategy accordingly. You can also take a look at search queries to see if the results are coming in right in line with what you intended. So therefore, you're making assumptions about an ad, and even after having placed it, measuring whether or not those assumptions are accurate.
Okay. Well, we've officially, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have an example of something similar we've done in the advocacy space more so for a trade association client, but we were trying to target people specifically who felt negatively about a certain issue. We were identifying them through a number of means, but we also used brand studies across YouTube and then as well as some research partner companies to validate it. Part of what it was, we were actually asking them, how do you feel about this? To validate that our targeting was on track, and then also taking a look at pre-exposure, post-exposure, how did the ad move the needle, what we were seeing with the digital polling, was that in line with the offline polling and the TV and everything else, and it generated some interesting insights and allowed us to tweak some of the targeting based on that.
So we've officially trumped the programmatic TV panel in nerdiness because we've already talked about intent signals and probabilistic. But we haven't said deterministic yet. The reason why I asked that question was because, not just in the political sphere, but we get a lot of pushback now that, data is ruling the day and that we're losing a lot of judgment, human judgment in the process. And what I'm trying to understand is how all of your platforms or practices enable people to understand human insights more. Is there any way, you gave a sort of good example, but a more specific example of where you overcame a perception of who you were trying to reach and you were able to shift a political strategy as a result of it?
So in our world, we have this conversation a lot, and we have the luxury of a lot of data with which to explain what we see happening. Because we do all this research on our own all the time, it's not custom research we do for clients, it's data that we've chosen to collect, and we collect it all the time. And I've got the same political data I've had for 7 years that I collect every single day in the field by doing these big waves of research that we do. So what that means is, for a client, I can describe segments or profiles that are interesting to them if it's party affiliation driven or ideology driven or what have you, demographically driven, behaviorally driven. I can create that segment and I can tell my customers lots more about those people that I already know. And this is what our software platform does. Likewise, when execution is happening, by simply observing the people that are engaging with the content, with whether that's video advertising, display, social, whatever, we can describe the people we're seeing engage, and oftentimes that profile looks very different than what that hypothesis was when people started. And for us, we end up in the position that we're not telling you you're wrong, we're simply showing what the data says. But it has a very impactful effect on the ability to influence execution while it's happening, which is what everybody really cares about to get that performance they want out of the campaigns ultimately. I do think there's a difference here that we shouldn't lose between the power of intent-based data and the use of that data for its purposes, for the appropriate purposes, in particular in the political world and at the right point in the cycle, from the kinds of data that describe how to best identify segments that you can influence and persuade or make aware of the candidate's platform and so on, which is kind of a different use case.
Okay. Okay, I don't think we're going to get a specific example today, but I didn't expect it because we're in a political season. What I'd like to ask is, how different are we now in this process than we were 2 years or 4 years ago? And what has really changed? Is it just the availability of data and the ability to match more things, or is there something more fundamental that's changed in the last 4 years?
I think the availability of data, the ease of onboarding, the additional layers of data, and being able to match up both political data and consumer segments, as well as some of working with analytics firms to pull in additional data, that is new. I think it's much expanded and cross-device, being able to not just look at cookie targeting, but also device ID. Can we find a multi-channel ID for people and identify them and target across platforms and devices?
Okay. Yeah, and I would just add, again, I don't mean to be dead horse here, but obviously, being aware of that there are pitfalls in the programmatic space that I think a lot of people 4 years ago were not as cognizant of, or just had convenient ignorance around the fact that there were a lot of problems with how we were buying these different segments. So that combined with much easier onboarding, much faster onboarding has really changed the industry. But on the negative side, I think one of the problems that we're finding in digital, at least in the political space, is now when we started our firm in 2009, we were getting advertising buys because we were working with different political organizations, and they were like, well, I mean, TV is going to be about $1 million. We're going to spend $250,000 on mail. We should probably do this new media thing. Facebook ads had just come out not that long ago. We should do some of that. Here's $10,000. And none of the experts in the political industry really cared about $10,000. So they're like, hey, those kids are doing some interesting things online. Let's work with them. So first we had to start to fight for actual budgets to make a difference. And now where I feel we're at is, because of the strengths of digital and because of all this targeting, there are many people who just look at digital as only a way to micro-target. And I think that as we all of us in a room are looking at our phones and our computers, we spend so much time digitally, why would you ignore like kind of the macro approach? And so, you know, we're always trying to find ways of being able to do both, and, you know, like looking as measurement evolves to be able to prove that like both are important.
I would add too that the ways in which we reach voters using the data that we have has changed in the way of format, meaning video and mobile. I mean, both are huge. If we were sitting here 2 cycles ago, we would not be having the same conversation that we are right now. Search was still on the rise. So when it comes to video, I think Cisco estimates that by 2017, 79% of digital content will be video. So the way in which we talk to voters that we target is changing and has to change. Same with mobile. So it's been proven that consumers find more relatable those brands that they see video on their mobile devices from. That can be either a video on their site or an actual ad. They're twice as likely to feel a personal connection to that brand as they are brands that they haven't seen those for. So again, 2 cycles ago, we wouldn't be referring to our personal devices in the same way that we are now, those that we type things in that we wouldn't ask anybody else, something we carry with us everywhere we go. So we need to acknowledge the formats in which we're delivering advertisements to voters as well.
Yeah, this is really not a data matching question, but I love that stat. And one of the things that made video advertising so impactful in the old days of TV and in the early days of the internet is it was so scarce and rare and novel. When 79% of all content is video, how do you differentiate and make it special?
Yeah, it will be. And you differentiate with exactly the second point that I brought up, which is it has to be a personal connection, speak to someone in a way that resonates with them, which is where the data comes in. So I think in politics, we're probably data rich and content poor. Now we have a lot of limitations in candidate time and accessibility. It's difficult to get time with a candidate in front of a video and produce content. It's difficult to turn that around quickly. I absolutely acknowledge that. But in the industry as a whole, we need to change that so that content is made for digital, but it's also made for mobile video.
Okay, sir.
I just want to add, I think the good news is, I think in DC, there is now a much greater average sophistication in the understanding of voter files and voter file matching and how that's now a norm, which I think is great. That's the good news. The bad news is that the challenge that people are going to hit next is understanding some of the limitations that come with voter file matching, right, and the realities, and I think Stephanie alluded to this on the last panel, that when you do matches from offline personal information from voter files, for example, into the digital worlds that we all live in, you have a match rate that addresses the relationship between the offline file of people you want to target and how many you can actually reach. That's typically somewhere between 20 and 40% is pretty normal in our world. So
no, I heard it was 80%.
It's closer to 99, I think. So in those realities, what becomes really important is the understanding that even if you're really successful reaching a segment that's been defined from the voter file, realize that you're reaching 30, 40% of the cohort that you really care about. So what are the other ways, what are the other tools you could take advantage of that go beyond that to make sure you're getting that reach and extension beyond that? And there's lots of ways to do it. Historically, in the digital world, outside of politics, even in the corporate world, the ways you would expand are sort of performance driven, which is to say I do lookalike modeling to find people who click or convert or what have you. That's great for corporate for selling more products. That doesn't work quite as well in the political world where the influence and what you're trying to accomplish is a bit different. But there's other techniques to get there.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that in a minute, but I want to follow up on this notion. Well, you invoked the unique ID, and then you were talking about the voter file, and I don't know, maybe this is obvious to everyone, but I've become aware recently that the industry, particularly agencies and brands, have become very focused on the persistent ID and the ability to associate data with all of the platforms that the user connects with. In political, is the voter file the persistent ID? Because you can attach any of this data down to that user. Is it the cookie or the device proxy for political marketing?
Yes.
Okay.
So I mean, like, you know, obviously it's different. On the Democratic side, there's 2 data vendors that people prefer to work with. And they both have IDs that, you know, right, we commonly use as like what the.
So where is the leverage in that? Like in cookie-based, arguably Google has it. In social-based, maybe Facebook, another company might have it. Every agency and brand in the world is trying to amass their own unique profiles across consumers. In this one, it's literally a democracy. Everybody has equal access to it, and it's what you do with it.
I would just say, having the persistent ID, all that does is it allows you to consistently get to somebody that you think is of interest. The far more interesting question is, how do I define who the people are that are of interest, right? There's a lot of sausage making and plumbing activity that's happened in the digital world over the last 4 or 5 years, and will continue for the next 5 years, which is all about how do I tie together that this guy's on his tablet, and he's on his mobile phone, and he's on his work desktop, and he's on his personal desktop, and I understand that's all the same guy. And there's a lot of technical stuff that we all do up here on the panel to try and create that consistency of understanding of that same user, even though we live in a world that's inherently anonymous. We don't know who the guy is, we just know it's ID 12574. So that's not an inconsequential problem. That's a big problem. And people like Google and Facebook have a tremendous leg up on everyone else in solving that problem because of their scale of observation of people. But that doesn't solve the deeper problem, which is how do I, in a more sophisticated way, engage with the right people, discover who the right people are that I want to influence.
I'll turn it to the audience in about 5 minutes for some questions to think about them. But I'd like to go back to an old industry homily, John Wanamaker's quote, which hopefully everybody knows, which is, he famously said 100 years ago that, I know that half my advertising works. The trouble is I don't know which half. And the more I cover the precision of database targeting, the more I come to that same conclusion. I don't want to name any DMPs, but when you drill down, the probability of them picking someone's gender right might be about 50% because of the complexity of all the cookies and devices associated with them, and browser, cookie deletion and inflation. So let me ask you, in the political sphere, how much better is it than 50%, knowing that you have this persistent ID of what they registered to do, and then your ability to associate to that?
I mean, to be honest, I think it's worse in the persuasion space.
So first, honest answer today.
But I will say in the DR space, I think it's got there's huge advances that allow for much more value in advertising. The problem with persuasion is, people hate political ads. So people are like fine being bombarded with ads for Coke, but like some candidate talking about how the other candidate is going to blow up schools, that may stop them from voting or change their mind. They still hate seeing it. So I think that there's a problem in political persuasion that would hurt performance if we're all being honest. But I think it's changing, and we look forward to making it more effective.
And we don't have a shopping behavior to track, which in the consumer space, tracking conversions and your ultimate conversion of making a sale is much easier to do. Because the conversion is secret?
Well, yeah. Don't you do polls and exits?
Well, there are polls, but then it's going to be self-reported exit polls, and then it's going to be sampled. That's then based out. You're not able to tie it back to an individual very easily at all.
Right.
I think that's a big missing link when you're talking about figuring out what advertising works. I think there's also sort of common wisdom of what levels of TV work for turning out, and what levels of TV and types of TV will persuade. And there's a lot of questions that we're all working to figure out of how do those same roles carry over.
Yeah, Google hasn't figured out an attribution model for that.
Well, we are definitely limited by the anonymity that you mentioned of the voting booth. We know whether or not someone turned out to vote, but not how they voted. And by that I mean we as an industry as a whole. But I will beg to differ that people don't necessarily hate political content. I have been surprised by their willingness to watch it and engage with it, and I do think that there are ways to measure along the way whether or not your ad is resonating. So as an example, last cycle Nikki Haley ran a 2-minute video that garnered 10 times as many views as the other videos on her YouTube channel. That's long-form content that voters were actually willing to watch. And then when measured, it was proven that there was 42% brand recall or brand awareness around Nikki Haley by those people who had seen the video than who hadn't. And so they're watching and paying attention. So I think the ways to measure along the way are probably, are your ads being seen? Are they then being viewed? Are they being engaged with? And are you actually changing behavior? And so when you look at the whole cycle, there are ways to measure and test along the way.
Just to clarify, I was talking about political advertising as a whole, and mainly TV advertising, and you know, and like I do think we've worked with Google and done some of the similar studies that you're referring to that I think definitely help prove their value. I would just say that if you look at like the Republican primary, for example, you look at how much Jeb Bush has spent versus Donald Trump on advertising, and obviously, like, you know, there's a number of things could be wrong. Maybe they just are bad ads, but like, they sure spent a lot of money to get nothing in the Republican side, and I would argue that it's because of the fact that they're not doing things like Nikki Haley was doing.
So quick lightning round answer to this question. I know that some of my political advertising works, I just don't know, fill in the blank percentage.
Oh.
You just happen to be to my left. So.
I know.
What was the question? Stays the question?
You start, Andy. Fill in the blank. I know that some of my political advertising works, I just don't know, fill in the blank percentage works.
As in, what percentage works? Oh, good Lord. As to what clients would say?
You and your esteemed knowledge of the industry.
Well, I think works is hard, right? So I think we were just talking about persuasion, right? And something the digital world is newer to is figuring out how you effectively measure persuasion as a different animal than intent or ultimate purchase, right? So we're always pushing what's the best way to measure success relative to your objective. I think that to your Wanamaker point, and I'll try and keep this speedy in your speed round, half is lost. I don't think that really is the question here, though, because we're not saying spend 90% of your budget on digital and spend 10 on TV. The market's not there yet, and we're not even advocating for that. What we all do advocate for, though, is make the best effective use and efficient use of the dollars you have, and there are better and worse ways to do that. So to give you an example, because I know you've been dying for examples today, we recently did a campaign for a presidential on YouTube using Google, and we ran some segments that were straight from the voter file that someone in town affectionately referred to me as the online direct mail business doing voter file matching. But ran some segments that were straight from the voter file, and they ran some segments based upon the kinds of data that we have in our sort of scale digital world that doesn't come from the voter file. And what we found was when we looked at things like skip rates, 19% of the people who received video advertisements pre-roll from the voter file segments did not skip. 45% of the people that we saw through our own segments did not skip. Now, there's a lot of factors that play into that, but clearly one of them is the quality of the data with which you're choosing who you want to see and who you want to expose the campaigns to that comes into play as well.
Okay. I think we're getting down there, so if there are any audience questions, this is a good time to field them. So what is the most interesting segment you've seen matched to the voter file? About a year ago, we did a story on this political DSP, Targeted Victory, which I think does a lot of innovative uses of segments, and they matched Wall Street traders to files. And I guess they're very influential people. They have a lot of money, and they care about some issues more than others. But that really taught that you can almost, if you can find the data, you can match almost any segment to the files. What is the most interesting one you've ever seen or heard of being matched in that way?
I've seen, I think there's almost everything is out there, and I think we have something on like boating, or you know, it's not interesting in a useful way, maybe, that I don't know. I can't really imagine the the opportunity where a political campaign is going
That
to
would
make
have
use
come
of
in
whether or
handy for
not you
Ted
own
Kennedy.
a boat.
Sure.
Yeah, as I don't know, but there's a lot out there. I think the issue segments and demographics and I think income plays a big factor in political views. We know, so some of those factors are the most useful, even if they're not always the sexiest.
No segments come to mind? Okay, so
I'll pull something out of, it's on politics, but I always thought it was really interesting. I was talking to a vendor once about all the work they do in automotive and how much data they have around people who prefer silver, which is one of the more popular colors, to black, to red, to green, and making sure they're optimizing towards like these video ads that are, if you are a fan of a blue car, making sure that you're seeing blue cars all the time. I
should
thought
ask
that was,
about
like,
red or
and
blue
interesting.
counties, maybe.
Yeah.
We have a question right over here.
Sorry, I can't see because the lights are blinding me.
Thank you. Craig Spiesel, Online Trust Alliance. It's really exciting, all the profiling and targeting can be done, but what about from the consumer perspective? Have you had any pushback in there? And just as a point of reference, 4 of the presidential candidates don't even have privacy policies on their websites today. So as we're going down this path, many of them are working on the shadow of the First Amendment. Just like to get your perspectives on data privacy and what can consumers do?
Can I ask you a question? Are the rules different for political candidates? Because I know like certain things like the do not call list, I believe they're exempt from. Do you know? Okay.
So, like I said, they're technically in certain states they are exempt. I mean, from a federal standpoint, they do have that exemption. But many state attorney generals actually feel that they're really are Kickstarter businesses in a sense, but they're operating in a sense, but there's a different set of rules. So, but I'm more concerned about what blowback or feedback have you had in those areas?
Fair question.
We haven't experienced much. I do think there's sensitivity around that, specifically with political campaigns and issue groups. They're aware of the potential for disaster there, and we kind of guide a lot of clients through things like making sure they've got a privacy policy on their site, what are appropriate uses of PII, what we don't want to touch, what they can. And I do think it's we see in the political space, you're seeing the data operatives that are handling very granular, personally identifiable information for field contacts, all of their work, are sitting much closer to the digital team than they are typically at a large retailer. Those things are much more separate on the consumer side, and it's very tightly connected in political, but I think the same rules apply. We treat it the same.
Yeah, I can tell you that at Google we take privacy very seriously, and regardless of category, regardless of industry, we work very hard to provide the utmost transparency and control over the ads experience. So if on Google you go to My Account, you can control your user data across the board, and if you go to ad settings, you can control your ad settings, including whether or not you receive personalized ads at all.
If I could ask maybe a closer, unless you have one. Relating to this question and also the bright, shiny objects, where do you think the technology is going to take us in the near future where it really jumps the shark? I mean, right now there's an uproar around biometrics and facial recognition technology, and there's possible legislation about that. It's the kind of technology that grew up out of nowhere. I mean, it was in Ivy League for a while, but now it's being deployed, and you can actually read people's minds with this technology. Is that something we're seeing being used now in targeting for political, and where do you think it could go? I mean, what is the limit?
I think we all have moments when we're hearing pitches, or sometimes I'm explaining to clients about different things we can do, and the client will be like, "Wow, that's really creepy." So I would say we are definitely trying to. I think it's important to not be creepy. Obviously, there is the ability to serve relevant ads to people, and I think that is much better. I am of the personal mindset that it's better to see an ad that you care about than something that has nothing to do with you. But I'll just throw out one, hopefully there are no vendors in here to do this, they'll take offense, but one of the things I know that's a little creepy to me personally is that there's a lot more technology around trying to listen to what type of TV ads a mobile device is hearing.
Samba TV.
Yeah, and there's one of the TV companies got in trouble for that not being clear that they were potentially listening to any of the ads that were playing.
Right.
And I think when you're at home, there's a certain level of privacy you expect, and to feel like your technology is monitoring you is something that that the industry as a whole is going to have to look at carefully and explain to people why that's a benefit and how they can make sure that they opt out.
And you mean that as a term of art, not as a committee to re-elect the president?
What's that?
Creep, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'd say one of the things that's at the heart of why we started Resonate was to understand why people vote for candidates or why they support certain causes. And at the heart of that is the values and motivations of people, the sort of psychological drivers to people. And it's something we've done for a long time. I think there's people who look at that from a layman's perspective and would say, well, that's kind of creepy to have that kind of data.
Right.
But the reality is marketers have used that data for 30, 40 years now in the offline world. We've simply brought that understanding into the digital world and we're applying it. I think bigger picture, I think something that in the digital world we'll all wrestle with over the next 5 years is, I think there becomes a point at which there's going to be a real debate about not whether I can opt out of advertising from a privacy perspective and so forth, but I think the whole model might flip where everyone knows they're being tracked and they frankly don't care that they're being tracked, but they want to have more control over what's done with that data. And that's very different than how we try and legislate today.
Are we good, Steve? Or?
No, we have to wrap. I'm sorry.
All right. We're on a tight ship here, but I want to thank the panel. Hopefully that wasn't too nerdy, and that you took something away from it. But I have a feeling we could do a whole day conference on this very subject. So thank you for participating.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, panel. Although the prospect of being able to tell political leanings from facial characteristics is a daunting. What does a democratic facial